Hello, everyone, and welcome to an episode of Code and the Coding Coders Who Code It. I'm Drew Bragg, and I'm joined today by John Nunemaker. John, for anyone who is not familiar with you, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm John Nunemaker. I'm a Rubyist for a long time, since 2006. Big fan of the language, Rails, all that kind of stuff. And I have a couple of software companies, BoxOut Sports, which is like sports marketing, social media graphics, Flipper Cloud, which is feature flags, and helping you release things safely. And then just recently Fireside FM, which is podcast hosting and analytics.
A man of many hats. And we're going to get into a lot of that, I think. Here, the way that this is going to work is I'm going to ask John 3 questions. I'm going to ask him what he's working on, what kind of blockers he has. If he doesn't have a current blocker, he can talk about a recent blocker he had and how he went about getting around it. And then the last question is, what's something cool, new, or interesting that you've recently learned or discovered? It doesn't have to be coding related. I feel like you've got a lot of great options there. So let's dive right in. John, what are you working on currently?
I literally was just changing the username and password on Backblaze, which is the storage for, that's a very literal answer, for Fireside. So we're in the process of we acquired it last week. It was like Monday or Tuesday. And now it's like transfer all the things. And so that's literally been like the last, I would say, week of my life has just been like either talking to people about Fireside or doing the transfers and things like that. For transfers, it's pretty straightforward and obvious. It's okay, it's hosted on Linode or Linode, however you pronounce that. And it's got Cloudflare in front of it. It has Backblaze B2 as the storage. It's like a S3 compatible storage thing. And then there's other various bits, Honey Badger and Papertrail and things like that that help make the service run and stuff like that. It's Capistrano. So I'm like relearning Capistrano because this is like an OG Rails app. So yeah, I had to get my SSH keys on all the servers. So it's literally just been like, we have this massive Google Doc of everything we could find, get the repos first, extract all the to-dos from it, and then just going through it with Dan, who's the seller on the other side. That's what I was working on just now. And I also this morning had a meeting with a young adult because I called him a kid when I was with him. And I was like, sorry, you're not a kid. You're like 20 years old. I'm just really old. I met with him and he's like trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life in coding and stuff like that. And so that was earlier today with some things like that.
I'm interested a lot about your acquisition of Fireside because you're a builder. You build things. You've built many things. I mean, you're also responsible for HTT Party, which feel like most everybody in the Ruby community knows, or at least has touched or interacted with or seen the CLI post-install command. So why acquire a company versus building your own podcast hosting platform?
For me, what it came down to is buy versus build was pretty simple. It was like, I love podcasting. I'm super interested in it. I'm starting to going on some podcasts. I've been sort of putting some ideas together to start some of my own. And so I was interested in that, but I'm like, I know how hard it is to build things from scratch. It's super hard. There's a ton of podcast hosts that are already out there. There's a billion of them. And even just in Ruby land, there's a few. Do I want to go out, start from scratch and try to get that going? I know how much work that is. And Fireside already existed. It already had revenue. It already had expenses. It had high profit margin. It was made by one person. And so it was really good support for one person, maybe 2 people. This kind of thing where you can buy it and immediately just start iterating and you already have a business that's real that has some product market fit and it's good to go. Whereas if you build it from scratch, you got to do all that from scratch. And that's what I'm doing with Flipper. And I was like, I don't want another thing to build from scratch. I'm I'm already building Flipper from scratch. It's mid 5 figures. So it takes a while to get people to be in a mindset where they're I'm ready to switch to something or I'm ready to upgrade or pay or some of that kind of stuff, if you're not actively on it all the time. And so I'm I know how much effort that takes on that. And then on the opposite side, I've got BoxOut, which is doing great. And so, we're hiring people into places there and we're doing stuff with that. But I was I don't have room for another one of those. And I don't have the effort for another one of Flipper, but something in the middle where I can help with the infrastructure stuff and performance and things like that. And other people who are also in on Fireside can work on the actual product and move that forward. That just kind of made sense. It was literally just mostly hey, this exists. The company was basically run like I would run a company, high profit margins, very low number of people. And it's been rock solid for several years. It just needs continual love and nudging. And I know people that can work on it right away. So I was I wasn't planning on it. I wasn't even actively looking. I was just going to do BoxOut and Flipper. And then it just kind of just fell in my lap. So
That was actually going to be my next question is like, how do you go about finding something? But we'll go to the next question is, so when you see this opportunity of Fireside and it's software, so it's sort of your jam, how do you go about assessing all the things that you just listed, like assessing the code, assessing the product market fit, the revenue and things like that? Is it really just someone hands you a sheet and it's like a Google Doc of here's how much we make and here's how much it costs to run, and by the way, my code is good, just trust me? Or is there a lot more to it than that?
It can be as much as you want it to be or as little as you want it to be based on your trust level with the seller. So we had a very high trust level with the seller because Dan Benjamin is OG Rails. He was the original Rails podcast. Like the very first one, I think, was him. And there was a 5x5 network. And then he kind of built Fireside because of all that kind of stuff. And so I'm like, there was a high trust factor. So we're like, that part will kind of be okay. Garrett, who is also in on Fireside and on Flipper with me, he was basically like, look, I worked on the code base for like a year and a half. So like a lot of the stuff, I either wrote it or I'm very familiar with it. So I have a high confidence in what we need to do and how to make all that work. So we got cheat mode because it's very rare that that would happen beforehand where you would just have that history. And like Dan, I think, was even an advisor for Garrett when he created Sifter, which is something he created on his own, like an issue tracking thing, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And so Dan and Garrett knew each other very well. Garrett was in the code base like as of maybe 2 years ago and still had access to everything and stuff. He was still listed on the website. All that kind of stuff was already there. And so that dramatically sped up that part because there's a high trust factor. It also sped it up for us, for Dan trusting us, because he was like, well, Garrett's worked on it. And he's like, yeah, I'm familiar with HTTP Party and John and stuff like that. So like he knew I wasn't going to come in and just lie and be dishonest and like try and wreck him or anything like that. Like we're both trying to make it work for both sides. So in that way, we got super lucky. You can go as far as you want. I was like, well, I'm very comfortable with QuickBooks, P&Ls, all that profit and loss statements, balance sheets, things like that. So I was like, just send me the current balance sheet and then the profits and P&Ls for the last 3-4 years. So he sent those over. They look great. So then I talked to a bank because I had financed a pretty large portion of it. And so I was talking with the bank and I was like, what else do you need? They're like, we need taxes. We need like whatever they submitted for taxes for like the last 3 years. I was like, okay. So I go back to Dan, get that, take it to the bank. The bank's like, cool, this looks good. That was the financial side of it. And that was really all that I cared about because I knew it was Rails. I knew it was Postgres. I knew it was Sidekick. I knew it was like all these things that I'm familiar with. I know that generally like how you run an app is you build features, you talk to users, you see what they need, and you build things for them and you fix their bugs. And so I'm like, if you do that kind of stuff where you talk to customers, you listen to them, you listen to their feedback, you solve their problems, you build new things for them, like software grows. And you got to talk about it as well. But like if you do those things and you talk about it and market it, it'll grow. It'll do those kinds of things. So that's kind of like the diligence that we did on our side was very low. I didn't look at the code. I had no access to the code beforehand. I didn't look at the database. I didn't get on the servers. I didn't ask about the architecture other than, is it Rails? Is it Postgres? Is it Sidekick or Good Job or whatever, stuff like that? How old is it? Ruby 2.7, Rails like, I think 6.1 or 6 or something. Like those are the kind of things that I asked, mostly just so that I would have some concept of what I was coming into. But yeah, it was more just like, I think I got lucky because it just kind of, Garrett's, in between on the two just made that due diligence period way easier. Like I should have probably did like more due diligence. Okay, well, how many annual plans did you have? And let's prorate the annual plans and deduct that from the purchase price. Or like, there's all these other things you can do to make it more complex. But I was like, look, this is a fair price. I'm comfortable with this. We don't have to do all that work. I can make it fast if we don't do all that work. And you can give me a little bit better price. You can avoid the pain. I can avoid the pain. And we have a trust factor here. So let's just knock this out. And that's basically what we did. We operated on a handshake until the bank was like, oh, we need something in writing. like
Sure.
A week before closing. I think it was like 3 days before closing. They're like, can we just get like a purchase agreement? And so it's, like, can you just make me a purchase agreement quick, lawyer? Yes, here it is. Okay, Dan, can you sign this quick? Yep, no problem. And that was it.
That's cool that you have that kind of opportunity present itself and that you're in a position to execute on it, because it is fascinating to hear like someone who's a builder and can build goes and acquires. And I don't run a company. I've never started one from scratch. I've never acquired one. So it's just to hear like, whenever I think like, man, it'd be so cool to like build my own product, I think from like, okay, Rails new and here we go. I don't think, oh, go and grab an available company or find a company that like maybe the guy running it doesn't really want to do it anymore or what have you. So it's an interesting approach. But you did mention also like you're still working pretty actively on Flipper.
Yes.
So how do you expect you're going to balance coming into this new code base? It's Rails, it's Postgres, it's something you're expecting, but you're not going to let Flipper fall to the wayside. So how do you plan on balancing the two?
So that's why I would never do it alone. I don't want to buy anything that doesn't have enough cash flow to support somebody to work on it. And so like with Fireside, what we did is we're like, okay, let's say we have Fireside and Flipper. I also have BoxOut. So Garrett works a couple weeks on BoxOut and then a couple weeks on Flipper currently. And so I do kind of more like, it's not separated so cleanly like that. So mine is, X hours on BoxOut, X hours on Flipper. And so that's kind of like how we split that up a little bit. So the nice thing, again, we have BoxOut is cash flowing, it's doing well. We're developing new features on that. We're moving it forward in the time that we have. There's other people that are also working on it that like are employees of the company, not contractors. So what I do is I just kind of make sure that there's enough time on each of the things. Like I just try and find like the right balance and work with my partners on those to make sure that they're happy with how I'm contributing and that the value I'm providing is equal to the pay that I'm receiving from those. But the nice thing is like, again, because I'm an owner in each of these, I can kind of slice and dice it based on the like return on investment for my time. So I can say like, you know what, if I put my time into BoxOut, there are certain activities that will be a higher return on investment for like me and all of my partners there. And that's more like helping run the company. So it's more like making sure we have people in the right spots that are working on the things that we need to work on and getting them done. And they're built to the like standards that we have and they're making customers happy and that kind of stuff. But like if I'm typing on a keyboard, it might not be the most effective use of my time there. Maybe it's me like reviewing pull requests from like 2 or 3 people that are making them versus actually making those pull requests. So that's kind of like how I more look at my role there is more like leadership or more like that. I'm still merging gem updates. Like I'm writing code there, but it's a lot less than what I used to do. So now it's more about enabling everybody else and less about me actually at the keyboard typing all the things. Flipper's the opposite, the complete opposite end of the spectrum, because there it's like, if I don't type code, then nothing happens. And obviously people will sense that and they'll be like, this product's dead. And so we don't want that. So that one is more of like, I'm actually writing code actively. How I balance is I split up my activities between the two. And obviously like some of the same things happen in both companies. And then with Fireside, how it'll work is I think we'll have Garrett and myself. And so he'll kind of be the primary product person on Fireside. I'll kind of be the primary person on Flipper. And then we'll both kind of cross over a little bit because our skill sets cross over. He's more front end design, marketing and stuff like that. I'm more back end and both of us can do Ruby and Rails and stuff in the middle and kind of sometimes he'll like whip something together and then I'll like clean up N+1 queries and make things faster. Or I'll put something out that's ugly in Comic Sans, not really, but maybe. And then he'll come in and like make it look nice. If you're going to have multiple things, doing multiple things by yourself is difficult. You want to get something under your belt that pays your bills, that is doing well, and then find a way rather than, I think what a lot of people do is they try to go to the moon with that thing. So like they try and turn it into like a home run. They put all this time and energy into it. But I'm like, SaaS apps just take time. They're the steady growth, like 5, 10, 15, 20% a year. Or some people have magical touch and they can grow like crazy. I don't. I just know consistency over intensity. It's like just keep putting in the work every week and making a difference and it'll keep growing. And then once you get in that spot, find ways to like maybe move that consistency to something else so that the same amount of effort, it has a higher return. So that's what I've always done. So like, I just kind of split up my week based on that. Is more like, well, which things value on each project and then which people to do them with. And I was not going to do Fireside alone, 100%. I was like, I have to have Garrett, have to have somebody marketing it, have to have that kind of stuff happening because it is a lot of work to do software. So.
I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Honeybadger. Do you want higher clarity in production, but don't have time to earn a PhD in observability? Forget logs, metrics, and traces. Honeybadger Insight is built around structured events. When you send your application logs and other events to Honeybadger, you'll unlock the power of Honeybadger's new querying language, BadgerQL. Use BadgerQL to answer any question about your data, convert any event into a metric, and chart your metrics on custom dashboards. You can do all of this on Honeybadger's free plan as part of their comprehensive monitoring suite, which includes error tracking, uptime monitoring, status pages, and more. Speaking of error tracking, did you know that an error is really just a first-class event in Honeybadger? In fact, you can use Insights and BadgerQL to explore all of your existing Honeybadger data in new ways. It's pretty cool. Give it a try today at honeybadger.io. That's honeybadger.io, and thank you, Honeybadger, for your continued support of the show. Agreed. On Flipper, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to do something selfish because we use Flipper at Podia and I love Flipper. So what do you have on the roadmap there? What's something cool? Like, give me a taste of what's coming.
What I'm most excited about, what my goal is before the end of the year, we'll see if it works or not. But I want to make expressions, which is like a new thing that's inside of Flipper, but it's basically like code only right now. There's no like Flipper UI or Flipper Cloud or like stuff like that on top of it. I want expressions to like really work. And so they're in the code base, they're like beta, you can use them, but like nobody really is, because if you don't have a UI that you can click, people just don't do it. And so what I want is I want that fully UI and available in cloud, in the Pro Gem, and in the like some version available in the open source gem as well, where they actually actively work and there's a way to like do things. So what expressions are is like we have Ruby blocks in Flipper. And that's how you kind of like get past that adding an individual person or a percentage of like people enablement. So you can say like, oh, if this group is an admin group. And so if user.admin is true, then that group is enabled, then all admins can access it, or employees or staff or whatever you want to do. And so that's a common thing, but a Ruby block is not very transferable between two systems and you can't change it at runtime. So if you have two Ruby apps that are using the same Flipper, and you want to turn things on at the same time by a group, you have to have that Ruby block in both of the projects, and it's got to be identical. And so like if it's not identical, then one might return true and the other might return false. And that's not a good thing. So expressions are basically this like very simple way to do logic that can replace the functionality of groups at runtime. It'd be the ability to change a group like employees at runtime instead of making a code PR and deploying it and then being able to change it. So what you do is you have Flipper properties. So instead of just a Flipper ID, which is what the old way is, just one ID and that's it. Now you have a Flipper properties hash. And so it's like a flat key, like plan. And the plan is basic, or the plan might be plus or pro or things like that. And so like once you have those kinds of things, then you can say, okay, now pipe this hash context into just a tiny little logic thing to say like, does flipper.property plan equal basic? If so, then it's true. Or maybe it could be like that. And also it needs to be like their age needs to be greater than 21. Or this controller, enable for these actions. Or this controller and action combo like 50% of the time. You can kind of build up. In Flipper in the old way, it was like you had a couple of add an individual actor, add a dynamic group, percentage of actors, percentage of time. Now you can combo all those together with like any or all or nested any's and alls. It's a very powerful way to, at runtime, change what's enabled and disabled and all that kind of stuff.
Is that a pretty common use case for Flipper where someone has multiple Ruby apps or Ruby instances that are running off a single Flipper?
So I would say that is less common. What's more common is people wanting to change the groups that either are not programmers or people wanting to change the groups that are programmers that don't want to have to deploy every single time they want to change that group. So that's the more common thing. And that's really what we're building it for. The side benefit is that now all of a sudden, everything is very cross-platform. It's cross-platform between Ruby apps. It's also cross-platform if we want to make a Go version, if we want to make a JavaScript version, if we want to branch out into other places that people have. We're building Ruby and Rails stuff, but Ruby and Rails people also have other things as well. And so the Go services here and there, stuff like that, we want to support those in addition to just the Ruby stuff. And so this makes that move really possible. And I think once people see it, they're going to be like, how did I not do it this way from the beginning? I built Flipper based on rollout. and rollout didn't do any of this stuff. And I never used LaunchDarkly or any of the other more complicated, targeting systems. And so once I started thinking about like, well, how do you get things cross-platform or change things at runtime? It was like, okay, well, you need some kind of a data structure that defines, this equals that, this is in this array, like kind of like a little functional programming language is basically what it is, but you can change at runtime, which is kind of cool.
I'm excited for it. It sounds pretty neat. And we definitely fall into the more common use case at Podia, but I think there's some ways we can leverage it. This is a loaded question because we just talked about a lot of stuff, but what kind of blockers with all the various things that you're involved with, what kind of blockers do you have daily, weekly, monthly, currently? What does that look like for you?
I would say my biggest blockers are typically the amount of time that I work. I pick up my kids from school at 3 every day and I'm try to be done. Like sometimes I'm not, sometimes I'm on a podcast or sometimes I'm on like writing code or I have a call that I just couldn't reschedule. But for the most part, I try to like kind of quit and just be with them. And so you're basically looking at 8 to 3. And I also play basketball and it's at noon and then you got to shower and some things like that. So like the time gets constricted a little bit like that. So honestly, like my biggest blocker a lot of times is just like prioritizing correctly and getting the next most important thing done and some of that stuff. There's definitely blockers that I hit. Like one annoying thing that I'm hitting right now is like the Flipper Cloud has analytics. And so we basically have client-side telemetry. We keep track of true, false per feature, per minute, and all that kind of stuff. We ship it to cloud. That raw data is, even though it's aggregated per minute, it's a lot of raw data because it's basically, once for every single process that's sitting out there. If it's Puma, then we get 5 threads and we get 1 submission, which is really nice. But if it's Unicorn or other things or Puma not in threaded mode, then we're getting one submission for every process. And so that is a lot of raw data. And we have to aggregate that raw data into like hourly data and graphs and stuff. And that raw data just grows eternally. And for whatever reason, I put it in my SQL. And so I've got nibblers that are kind of like deleting the old stuff and things like that. So that storage gets pretty big and like cost wise, it could be half as much as just running all the app servers and all the other things together. Just that analytics data can be half of the cost. And so it's like trying to keep that compacted. For whatever reason, I chose MySQL on that part instead of Postgres. I don't have to explain why and go all the way in depth, but because I don't have like some of the same stuff that I've done in other areas where I've actually done partitioned by like day, and then I can drop old days and just keep a sliding window of 2 weeks and kind of query aggregates on top of that stay for longer periods of time. I'll probably switch it to that before too long. I tried something new and it's just been kind of a little bit costly. So because of that, but yeah, those are some of like, I guess more technical things would be that.
I feel you on the fitting everything into your day blocker of just like, how do you cram everything in? How do you know what to prioritize? That stuff is constant. I feel like that's a constant battle, but I also feel like neither one of us are alone on that, where a lot of people I talk to are like, well, finding what to prioritize, finding the time to do the things that I want, finding time for deep work so that I'm not like, today I've got 9 meetings and no time to code. So how do I get something done between those meetings and stuff? Do you have any strategies that you're using or exploring, something that might work or is working for you that helps with that kind of stuff?
It's a really good point that you don't have to work on multiple software projects to have that issue, because there's always different types of work that you have to get done. I definitely miss the days of where all I was doing was just coding all the time. And that was great. So what I do now is I try to create chunks, 2 to 3 hours. And then I'll try to focus ahead of time at the beginning. I'll write down like, these are the 4 things I'm trying to get done. And I try to do them in order, regardless of the amount of time that they take. But like you said, you kind of have to fit it up to say, well, I've got 3 hours, but I have a 4-hour task and it's the most important. So you have to decide, do all the other tasks that aren't quite as important, but would take 15 minutes? Like, is it better for me to get 10 of those done? So there is some balance on it and stuff. And I guess some of that's just gut and experience. It's hard to say, but I would say what I try to do is I try to make chunks, and then I try to, ahead of time in that chunk, decide what I'm going to do and not get distracted. Everybody knows this. It's very easy to be like, oh, there's a new email. Now I'm checking email for 3 minutes or 10 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is. Or there's a text message. I use Focus a lot on Mac. There's that little thing up top you can click. It's on right now. Do not disturb. And I'll click that on quite regularly, much to the chagrin of my wife, because I'm just like, there's times where you're like, you just can't have the dinging. And I turn notifications off like relentlessly. I have very few notifications, badges, turn those off. Like everything I do, I just try to keep it really lasered in on like, what am I trying to get done the next 3 hours? And okay, now let's start with the first hour and go from there. So I actually time track. The last like month or two, I started tracking my time. I don't have to. I don't bill anyone. I don't invoice anyone. But I was like, am I spending the time on the things that I want to spend the time on? And I was just finding that I didn't feel like I was. I felt like I was just naturally getting pulled into problems or things like that. And I was like, I kind of want to know. So I was like, well, there's only one way. You have to like actually track the time and say, based on this time tracking, this is my goal. Am I achieving that goal or not? So I would say time tracking, I'm using like a Toggle or something like that. It's like TOGGL, no E. I started using it a couple of days ago. I was using Tick before that TickSpot. I just switched because the way it works is just a little bit different and better for my flow. I think that helped a lot, was time tracking and then making big chunks and then focus mode and really deciding before I start working, what do I want to get done? And then if I'm not doing that, just not allowing myself to switch off of it. So
interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought about time tracking unless you're billing someone, because it just seems like, oh, I've got to put my billings together, so I need to track what I'm working on. But the idea of tracking it as a way of monitoring making sure that you're getting done, spot checking yourself and your assumptions of like, yeah, I'm productive. It could also be interesting to see like, oh, what time of the day am I most productive? I know you're in more of a situation of like, I have 8 to 3 and that's what I work on. But like, the last job I was at, I kind of augmented my schedule because I did notice that I was way more productive after 10 a.m. No matter what time I was sitting down, it was like 10 a.m. is when I started getting productive. So if I sat down at 7, it was 3 wasted hours. If I sat down at 9:30, it was a half hour wasted before I got really productive. So I wonder if I would have caught that earlier with actual time tracking. Good call.
That's fascinating. It feels really weird because again, I'm not invoicing it. And actually, I was talking to Jeremy at Indie Rails at Rails World, and he was like, oh, I'm obsessed with time tracking. He was like, I know that it takes me 1,500 hours to plan a conference. Every single thing, he knows exactly how long it takes. And so then when he goes to, or like it's X hours a week to do a podcast. And so if you're going to do a podcast and you're going to start another one, you got to know it's going to take me another 5 hours. Do I have that in my schedule or do I not? And I was like, that's actually another take on it versus mine. Mine was more just making sure between 2 or 3 things, what am I spending my time on and does it match up? Like if I feel unproductive at the end of the day, was I unproductive or did I just feel unproductive because I didn't do the things I wanted to do? And that's made me feel a lot better. But I also like his slant on it where it's now I know exactly how long lots of things take. And so I can say yes or no to them right away because I'm like, no, I know this is going to take this long, which is kind of cool too.
Jeremy Smith is notorious for attention to detail. So that doesn't surprise me that he would have like a breakdown of minute by minute, hour by hour of how long it takes. But yeah, Blue Ridge Ruby, whatever number he gave, I was like, that's insane. Thank you for reminding me to never do this myself because good Lord, my wife would kill me. So the last thing, which I feel like you'll also have some pretty great answers for, is what's something cool, new, or interesting that you've recently learned, discovered, even built. Doesn't have to be coding related, but it's code and the coding coders who code it. So if you want it to be about code, that's totally fine.
Like about 6 months ago, I want to say, and it's still really fresh in my head because I keep going back to it and making improvements and stuff, is when I worked on the Flipper telemetry stuff. And when you do telemetry, you need to observe the process, what's happening, and then in the background somewhere, you can't do it in the main thread. Let's say you want to just track every time a feature flag was true or false. If you're going to, every single time that happens, you're going to submit an HTTP request in the main thread all the way over to an endpoint, like every single request is going to get super, super slow. So you're like, well, that doesn't work. So then what do you got to do? Well, you got to batch them. So then it's like, okay, well, I'll send 100 at a time. But you still, every 100, now you're sending this HTTP request in the middle of a Rails request. And that's not ideal. So you're like, okay, I have to background this. So I need to push this work onto a queue. And then I need another thread running somewhere that can pull off the queue and submit it. And so now you're adding a little extra CPU work. but you're like shifting that workload out of the main request into like the background. And so it's the same thing with Flipper's polling and how it synchronizes. It's all in a background thread. It doesn't do anything in the main thread except the actual like adapter rights, which are local to your, like if you're updating Active Record, that's local to your, let's say, data center or your hosting environment. So those are fast. So it's like, hey, here's 2 new actors we found in cloud. Just apply that in the main thread. That's fine. No problem. Then you don't have to deal with all the threading issues of like every single data store in the history of the world being used to store feature flag stuff. So I went down this rabbit hole and like learned, and I basically got every single Ruby SDK that had like background threading in it, all the different feature flag ones, all the different APMs, application performance monitoring solutions. And I was just like, how do they do this without bringing people's apps down? Or do they bring people's apps down? And so I have this entire VS Code project that's like 30 of them. And I just went through all of them and just read because I'm very much like I don't want to fail. So I'm going to spend way more time researching ahead of time to avoid failing versus probably would be better to just slap some stuff out there and get going. But I just can't work that way. I was like, I don't want to do this wrong. I don't want to mess it up. So I was like, I'm going to have to like learn. So I went through all of them. I learned a lot about concurrent Ruby. And so I hadn't really done anything with that because I haven't really, we're Rubyists. We don't write stuff in threads, you know?
Yeah, sure.
That's what the GVL is for. So because of that, I had to learn and I saw these different patterns. At first, you're like one thread. And then you have like inside there, you have like a loop. And it's just like a loop and it's just popping things off of a queue. The queue is kind of like the shared between like your main request thread and then this worker that's going to do some work in a background. And that loop is just popping stuff off. And then once it gets to like, let's say 100, it batches it, does an HTTP request, all that kind of good stuff. I'm like, okay, that's cool. But then it's like, well, what if your endpoint's down? And so it's like submitting, but it's down. So it's going to, okay, well, I got to retry. So you add retries. And then you're like, but now I'm retrying, but I'm also backing up on my queue in between the two because I've got another 100 and another 100 and another 100. And so you're like, okay, well, that's actually not maybe the best pattern for how to ship the data. And so what I kind of learned with concurrent Ruby, that like a common pattern is you have thread pools. So like a fixed thread pool or like a expanding and contracting thread pool. It's just the same mental model as like a Puma, with 5 workers, either forked or threaded. It's the same mental model. It's just things are a little different. And so I was like, oh, that's really cool. So you can have one worker that's basically just like, get me like a batch. And so you're like, give me like 100 things to like send somewhere. And so it's got a queue in between, adding up all this like bunch of work that needs to be done. And then you have this like fixed thread pool. It's maybe like 2 threads, 3 threads, whatever size you want to make. And that's what's actually doing the HTTP requests. And so you like basically create this like batch of work of like a bunch of things. And then you like post that to the fixed thread pool to say, hey, whenever you have time, ship this off to this endpoint and whatever happens, it's cool. And it goes right back to its work. So it's constantly just pulling things off, creating batches and pushing them to the next place. It's kind of creating this pipeline. So your first pipeline is the main thread, which is pushing things onto the queue. Your second one is pulling things off the queue into batches. So it's kind of aggregating them. And then your last queue is just saying, given a batch, spend some time to try and get this to the endpoint and have it be successful. And so then a lot of your code gets a lot more simple because each thing is doing one specific part of that pipeline. And so it's a lot easier to look at and understand. And then like your submission stuff at the end is really simple. It's like, do a net HTTP request. Did it fail? Try it again. Did it fail again? I give it a little more like of a sleep back off. And you can sleep because the threads will slip between them. They're okay with those sleeps. So your retries are a lot easier. And you can say, also that batch thing can kind of like receive more than it can actually do. So you could have 5 threads back there that are like working on submitting these and all 5 are stuck. But you could say, well, it's okay if I queue up like 5 more of those batches in memory because eventually they're going to go through and typically it only takes 10 milliseconds to do this. It's just happened to take like 100 or more this time. And so it gives you a little bit of a buffer so you don't lose data if your endpoint is down. And I was like, this is sick. It was just really cool to like see that process and then write something that worked that way. And if anyone listening wants to go see it, it's in Flipper Cloud Telemetry. Like if you go to the repo and you go into like Flipper Cloud and then telemetry. So it's somewhere in there. And like there's workers and fixed thread pools. And like it looks really scary, but it's really not. It's a simple pattern of just like you push onto a queue, you aggregate off that queue and then put that into a new queue, basically, which each thing has one job. So that's probably the coolest like code thing that I've learned recently. And I started to write up part 1, like maybe January. And I posted that and I have not written part 2. And it's almost January again. Never write a 5-part post with only one in the tank. Never do that. So
it'll be a 5-year series. You'll get one out every January.
Whether you want it or not, it's going to happen every January. So that was probably the coolest code thing that I've learned. And then like the coolest non-code thing would just be like going through the whole process of financing an app was really fascinating. There's like SBA loans, which you personally guarantee, but you don't have to put collateral up for. And then the interest rate's really high. So it's like 11%. And then there's like commercial loans, which you put up collateral for and also personally guarantee, but the interest rate's maybe like, I ended up with like below 6.5. So the interest rate was like significantly lower, which is kind of cool. So I think it was neat to like, learn some of those things, learn when you're putting up collateral, different collateral the bank likes more. They deal in houses all the time. They know exactly what to do with a house. So they'll give you collateral up to 80% of the equity you own in your house, So if you own your whole house, you get it appraised, you can take out a commercial loan for 80%, snap your fingers and wait 3 weeks and it's done. And you can just receive that funds in a bank account. That's kind of wild. I didn't even know that was a thing. So that was really interesting. And then the SBA side is a lot more work, a lot more paperwork, a lot higher interest rate. You typically have to have a quicker payoff, like a 5-year payoff. Whereas like the commercial loan, with collateral, they have the collateral. So they don't really care when you pay them back. And so you can do like a 15-year loan, which lowers your payment. And then you can just pay it off early. There's no prepayment. It was interesting to learn like some of those kinds of things. Again, it's not code, but fascinating way to see like how you can kind of leverage in a safe way.
Like I've mentioned earlier, it is a fascinating bit of the industry that like, when you're first getting into it, you're like, code. I want to write code. I'm going to write code. And I'm going to build things. And then like you get into it and it's like, turns out people do a lot of different things in this industry, including getting loans to buy companies and then iterating on that product, and software is everywhere. And you get to touch all kinds of different aspects of it the longer you're in it, which is super cool. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about while you have airtime still? Because I know that you have another thing. I won't spill the beans. I know you have another thing coming up. So I want to respect your time, but I also want to give you as much time as possible to like talk about whatever you want.
All I would tell people is definitely check out Flipper. It's cool. I don't know how people deploy software without it. I literally like, even if it made zero money, for how many years, and I still like, I'm so used to it. When I talk to people who are like, oh, I don't use feature flags. And I'm just like, I'm genuinely curious. I'm not even trying to sell them. I'm just like, what do you do? How do you do this? How do you do that? And it's like, well, they do use feature flags. They just have like homegrown stuff instead of a standard way of doing it. And I was like, okay, that makes me feel at least a little bit better. You have an employee predicate method on user, and you do at least use that first. Stuff like that. Check that out, and feel free to check any of the other things out too. But that's the one that's probably most applicable.
Yeah, I'll plus one you on that. We love Flipper at Podia, and I've used other homegrown solutions that are either called Flipper flags or not called that, but that's essentially what they are. And having something standardized like Flipper is so awesome. And I'm so happy that Podia used it when I got there, that it was just easy to like slip right in. And if something goes awry with the deploy, just flip it right off. And I'm with you. I don't know how people do it without it, because that's terrifying. How did I do this for so many years? Yeah. Plus one on Flipper. Awesome. Well, thanks for your time today. You're obviously a very busy man, so I really appreciate you carving out some time to come on and talk about all the cool things you're working on.
I will come on anytime. I'm not a busy man. I just compacted into a small
Sounds
window.
like you're a busy man.
Because I'm like, if you're quitting at 3, you're not really that busy. I'm basically taking 2 hours off every day. So it's not that crazy. But yeah, this was awesome. This is great. And thank you for saving me at Rails World when I was trying to figure out where the subway was.
Oh, yeah. No, I got you. Yeah, it was, listen, I was also confused. I was like, I'm either going to be right and this is going to be great, or I'm going to be wrong and we'll just both be confused. It'll be fine.
Yep.
No, it was great seeing you at Rails World, and see you at the next one.
Yeah, hopefully.